Picture this. It's the early 20th century, and Russia is a vast empire, a land of stark contrasts. On one side, you have the extravagant wealth of the Tsar and the nobility, living in gilded palaces. On the other, the overwhelming majority of the population, peasants and factory workers, are trapped in a cycle of crushing poverty and despair. This wasn't just a gap, it was a chasm, and it was about to swallow an entire empire. At the top of this fragile pyramid sat Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years. Nicholas was an absolute monarch, meaning his word was law. He believed he was chosen by God to rule, and he fiercely resisted any calls for political reform. While the rest of Europe was experimenting with democracy and constitutions, Russia was stuck in a political time warp. The Tsar ignored the Duma, a toothless parliament he had created, and relied on a secret police force to crush any dissent. For the millions of ordinary Russians, their needs were not just ignored, they were invisible to the crown. Life for the average person was brutal. In the countryside, peasants worked on land they often didn't own, using outdated farming tools. They were desperate for land reform, for a piece of soil to call their own. In cities, a new industrial working class was emerging, but their conditions were just as grim. They were crammed into squalid tenements, working grueling hours for pitiful wages in unsafe factories. Food shortages were common, and the price of bread could mean the difference between life and death. This widespread suffering created a hotbed of discontent. Secret revolutionary groups began to form, spreading ideas of socialism and communism, whispering promises of a better future. Then came the tipping point, World War I. In 1914, Russia entered the war with a surge of patriotism, but this quickly evaporated. The war was a catastrophic disaster for Russia. The country wasn't prepared for a modern, industrial conflict. Its factories couldn't produce enough supplies, its railway system was inefficient, and its military leadership was often incompetent. Russian soldiers were sent to the front lines, sometimes without rifles, told to pick one up from a fallen comrade. The result was staggering casualties, millions killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Back home, the war crippled the economy. The costs of living skyrocketed. Food and fuel became incredibly scarce because the transportation system was dedicated to the war effort. Women would stand in bread lines for hours, often only to find there was nothing left. The people's anger, which had been simmering for decades, was now boiling over. They had lost their sons and husbands in a pointless war, and now they were starving. The blame fell squarely on the shoulders of the Tsar and his government. In February 1917, the pot finally boiled over. It started with women textile workers in the capital city of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, who went on strike, demanding bread. The next day, they were joined by thousands of other workers. The protests grew into a massive, citywide strike. The Tsar, who wasn't even in the capital, ordered his troops to fire on the protesters to restore order. But this time, something was different. The soldiers, weary of the war and sympathetic to the people's plight, refused. Many of them even joined the revolution, turning against their officers, with the capital in chaos and his own military abandoning him. Tsar Nicholas II was powerless. His generals advised him that the only way to save the country in the war effort was for him to step down. And so, in March 1917, Nicholas abdicated the throne, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule in a surprisingly swift and bloodless collapse. The age of the Tsars was over. Russia was now a republic. In the wake of the Tsar's fall, a new government was formed. It was called the Provisional Government, and it was made up of moderate politicians from the old Duma. They promised to establish a democratic republic, with civil liberties like freedom of speech and assembly. It seemed like a new dawn for Russia. However, this new government was weak from the very beginning. It had to share power with the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers who had their own agenda and controlled the capital's military forces. The provisional government made a series of critical mistakes. Its biggest error was deciding to continue the war against Germany. The people were desperate for peace, but the government felt bound by its alliances with Britain and France. This decision drained what little public support it had. Furthermore, it failed to address the 2 most pressing issues for the majority of the population, land and bread. It postponed any major land reforms, telling the peasants to wait for a future elected assembly. But the peasants were done waiting. They started seizing land from the nobility on their own. The food shortages in the cities also continued, and the government seemed unable to solve the crisis. While the provisional government floundered, another political force was growing in strength. The Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were a radical Marxist party, and their leader was a brilliant and ruthless revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland, but the Germans, hoping to destabilize Russia and knock it out of the war, arranged for his return in a sealed train. When he arrived back in Russia in April 1917, he immediately condemned the provisional government. Lenin had a simple, powerful message that resonated with the masses. He offered the people exactly what they wanted, summed up in a brilliant slogan: peace, land, and bread. Peace meant an immediate end to the war. Land meant the redistribution of estates to the peasants, and bread meant an end to the food shortages. While other parties debated and delayed, Lenin offered decisive action. He also promoted the idea of all power to the Soviets, arguing that the workers' councils, not the bourgeois provisional government, should rule the country. The Bolsheviks' popularity soared, especially among the soldiers, sailors, and factory workers in the major cities. By the autumn of 1917, the time was ripe. The government was in disarray, the army was demoralized, and the Bolsheviks had gained a majority in the key Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin, who had been in hiding after a failed uprising in July, urged his party to seize power immediately. He argued that they couldn't wait for elections. They had to act now or the opportunity would be lost forever. On the night of October 24th, 1917, which is November 6th on our modern calendar, the Bolshevik Revolution began. It was a swift, well-organized coup. The Bolshevik Red Guards, their paramilitary force, took control of key points in Petrograd: the telephone exchange, railway stations, power plants, and bridges. There was very little resistance. The final act was the storming of the Winter Palace, where the leaders of the provisional government were meeting. In a scene later, mythologized by Soviet propaganda, the palace was taken with minimal bloodshed. The provisional government had collapsed, just as easily as the Tsar's regime had months earlier. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in charge. The Bolsheviks' victory wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new, even more violent chapter. Their seizure of power plunged Russia into a brutal civil war that would last for nearly 3 years. On one side was the Red Army, the newly formed military of the Bolshevik state, led by the brilliant organizer Leon Trotsky. On the other side was the White Army. The Whites were a loose and disunited coalition of everyone who opposed the Bolsheviks. This included monarchists who wanted to restore the Tsar, liberals who wanted a democracy, moderate socialists, and foreign powers like the United States, Britain, and France, who were terrified of communism spreading and sent troops to intervene. The Civil War was a period of unimaginable horror. Both sides committed terrible atrocities. The Bolsheviks instituted a policy known as the Red Terror, executing thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution without trial. The White Armies also carried out their own White Terror, targeting communists and Jewish communities in brutal The former Tsar, Nicholas II, and his entire family were executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918 to prevent them from becoming a rallying point for the Whites. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks won the war. Why? They had several key advantages. They controlled the industrial heartland of Russia, including Moscow and Petrograd, which gave them access to factories and railways. Their Red Army, under Trotsky's command, was a disciplined and effective fighting force, and crucially, they were united under a single, clear ideology and leadership, while the White Armies were a fractured mess of competing interests who couldn't agree on a common goal beyond defeating the Bolsheviks. The peasants, while not necessarily loving the Bolsheviks, often preferred them to the Whites, who they feared would take back the land they had seized. With their victory in the Civil War secured, the Bolsheviks set about building the world's first communist state. They had already nationalized all industries, banks, and private property. Now, they solidified their one-party rule, banning all other political parties and establishing a totalitarian state with the secret police, now called the Cheka, at its core. In 1922, a new entity was formally created, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. It was a federation of republics, but in reality, all power was centralized in Moscow, in the hands of the Communist Party. The Russian Revolution, which had begun with cries for bread and freedom, had ended by creating a powerful and authoritarian state that would shape the course of the 20th century. It inspired communist movements around the globe and set the stage for the Cold War, a decades-long ideological struggle between the communist East and the capitalist West. The echoes of those 10 days that shook the world in 1917 can still be felt today. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time.